All right, so President Vladimir Putin will be arriving in New Delhi later in the day today for a two-day state visit. The trip will be the Russian president's first one since the Ukraine war in 2021. Now, Vladimir Putin and the Indian Prime Minister are expected to discuss a whole host of different issues during this visit, with a focus on geopolitics and also potential defense deals, including fighter jets and a missile defense system. Now, this visit comes in the backdrop of US President Donald Trump pressuring India to scale back energy purchases and economic ties with Moscow. Now, apart from bilateral ties, President Putin and Prime Minister Modi could also be discussing about strengthening cooperation in various multinational platforms. Now, India and Russia are parts of several platforms, including the trilateral RIC. They are the core members of the BRICS and the founding members of the SEO. The visit could also be an opportunity to revive the old Russia, India and China, that is the RIC forum. Originally envisioned to counter the West's dominance, the group has become more relevant in view of recent American protectionist measures, including renewed tariffs and also trade restrictions. Now, RIC activities came to a halt in 2020. The outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic has globally disrupted diplomatic schedules and international gatherings. And this was quickly followed by the India-China military standoff in eastern Ladakh, culminating in the Galwan Valley clash, which marked the most serious border conflict between the two nations in decades. The most recent wave of interest in reviving the RIC has been led by Moscow and Beijing, and Russia asserts that it is in active dialogue with both New Delhi and Beijing on this matter. Now, China says that it stands ready to maintain communications on advancing trilateral cooperation. New Delhi remains non-committal about any immediate revival of this trilateral grouping. At the heart of India's cautious approach lies its very uneasy relationship with China. The talks of the group's revival had gained momentum during the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit in China's Tianjin in August. At the summit, the warmth between the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, the Russian President Vladimir Putin, and also the host, Chinese President Xi Jinping, was very evident. Now, India's relationship with China has improved since 2020, while China and Russia have grown closer during the Ukraine war. All right, now joining us on the broadcast, we've got WION's Siddhant Sibal, who's joining us live here. Siddhant, this is a crucial visit by the Russian President Vladimir Putin. Tell us what is on the agenda.
A significant visit. In few hours from now, the Russian president will be in the Indian national capital, Delhi, which is decked up with Russian flags and with pictures of the Russian president, Vladimir Putin. Now, this is a visit coming after several years. His last visit was in 2021. And during this visit, a two-day tightly packed visit, focus will be on announcements in areas like trade, where India wants to decrease the trade deficit with more imports to Russia. Focus on mobility pact that will give work permit to more Indians, especially skilled Indians, to work in Russia, which is facing a major manpower crunch. But above all, both sides will be sending a message and a signal, the big picture as to how India's strategic autonomy is very dear to India, and for Russia, essentially as to how it is engaging with Asian giants like India and China for trade, for political relationship. We know that the visit will see a release of a joint statement as well, and we will also see a lot of optics as well, visuals that will be carefully watched across global capitals.
Indeed, that is, of course, going to be key. Now, one of the important aspects of this visit, Siddhant, is besides defense and oil, this people-to-people connect is what is being talked about, is going to be a cornerstone of the visit. Tell us more about that.
Well, the Mobility Pact is seen as a cornerstone announcement of the entire visit. This is something that was in making for several months now, and it's a win-win for both sides. For India, which is increasingly signing mobility pacts with several countries, and of course want Indians to be part of the global workforce. This is a crucial pact. Remember that India has several times called for legal migration, and mobility pacts are the future. And for Russia, which, as we have already discussed, is facing a manpower crunch, it needs more people. And India, which is the most populous planet most populated country on the planet is keen that its workforce get places where they can work. We know that there have been mobility pacts with countries like Japan, with countries in Europe as well, and Russia is a major country with which India is going to announce and sign this mobility pact.
Thank you very much, Siddhant, for joining us with all those updates then. And also on the broadcast, we are joined by Dr. Brahma Chelani, who is a professor of strategic studies at the Center for Policy Research. Professor Chelani, thank you very much indeed for joining us here on WION. Now, Russia and India have enjoyed a relationship that goes back decades. Defense had been the cornerstone pillar of the India-Russia equation. And since the Ukraine war, and because of Western sanctions, India had been purchasing Russian oil as well. Now, just to quote some statistics here, $52.73 billion of Russian oil is what India purchased in the year 2024. But that happened in the context of the Ukraine war and the Western sanctions. But if the Ukraine war were to come to end, as is expected, how do you see this equation of India purchasing Russian oil develop from here?
I'll put it in the larger context. India has been a major importer of Russian oil, but there are other large importers of Russian energy, including the European Union, China in particular, but also Turkey and Japan. In fact, the European Union has paid Russia more than $300 billion for energy purchases since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So in comparison, the Indian purchases of Russian oil do not equal that figure. If the Ukraine war were to end, certainly the discounts on Russian oil are going to dissipate gradually. So Russian oil will be sold at the international benchmark. But I think given the equation between Russia and India, and given the fact that several Indian major refineries now are utilizing Russian crude, and they're pretty happy with the quality of Russian crude, so Russia will remain an important supplier, maybe not to the same extent, but certainly a long-term supplier, and especially if the sanctions on Iran also were to be lifted, then Iran, of course, is next door to India.
Right.
And traditionally, it has been the cheapest source of crude oil for India. That would make things much easier for India's energy markets.
I think that's a significant point. And another aspect that's being talked about, Professor Chelani, is about the RIC, the Russia, India, China grouping. Can it be revived? The Ukraine war has pushed these three nations much closer. But do you think we have the conditions at this moment to revive the RIC? Do the three nations of Russia, India, and China, do they have enough convergence points for something like this to be done?
It has to be kept in mind as to why RIC faded away. It largely lost its relevance because of BRICS. These three countries of RIC, Russia, India, and China, they formed the BRICS, which was a four-member grouping initially. Then BRICS brought in South Africa, became a five-member, and now it's expanded considerably. So once BRICS was formed, and the fact that Russia, India, and China were central figures in BRICS, RIC lost its relevance.
Right.
So even if we revive RIC, what will RIC achieve that these three countries cannot discuss in the BRICS format? So I don't think we should place too much emphasis on RIC, especially given the fact that relations between India and China remain strained, even though efforts have been underway since October of last year to mend those ties. The fact is that China still masses tens of thousands of troops along the India frontier, and there hasn't been de-escalation and de-induction of forces. And given the underlying rivalry between China and India, the RIC has important structural constraints which will always limit its utility.
Right. Now, my final question to you, Professor Chilani. Some experts are suggesting that Vladimir Putin's visit to India, in the manner that nations such as India, Russia, China, Brazil, they seem to be coming together, points to what many people would say is a post-Western world order. Is that an assessment that you share as well?
Well, that might be an aspiration, but that's a distant vision. Today, India's strategic priorities call for constructive relations with both the United States and Russia. The central diplomatic challenge for New Delhi is to maintain a careful equilibrium between Washington and Moscow so as to safeguard the independence of India's foreign policy. And now, as US policies in recent years have helped push Russia closer to China, India has an even stronger incentive to keep its relationship with Moscow steady and substantial. In other words, the need for India to preserve a resilient partnership with Moscow has only grown more pressing. So in that context, President Putin's visit to New Delhi is very important. And I think it's also very important internationally because it sends a very powerful geopolitical statement that even though Western policy through unprecedented sanctions has driven Russia closer to China, Moscow is signaling that it has options beyond China, that India is going to remain a major partner of Russia, and that Russia will never allow itself to become a junior partner of China. And I think that's a very important statement that is going to come out internationally from Putin's India visit.
I think you've summed it up really well there. Thank you very much indeed, Professor Brahma Chilani, for joining us with that perspective there.